My sister convinced our parents that my personality was a liability to her new high society life. They threw her lavish wedding in secret, and I only found out by accident while holding a custom gift meant for her special day. When I confronted them, they told me my gritty career and loud nature would humiliate them in front of her wealthy new in-laws. They demanded I walk away and never ask them for a single dime. They had absolutely no idea that I could buy her new husband and his entire old money bloodline with a single phone call. Let me tell you how I tore down their perfect illusion piece by piece. Growing up as a dark-skinned black woman in a family obsessed with respectability politics meant my very existence was constantly scrutinized. I was Chloe the loud one, the gritty one, the daughter who worked with her hands instead of marrying into a country club. My parents, Jamal and Brenda, poured all their hopes into my younger sister, Maya. Maya was lighter, brighter, and completely willing to mold herself into whatever shape would attract wealth. I chose a different path entirely. I built Obsidian Estates from the ground up, turning distressed properties into luxury vacation rentals across the country. I poured my blood, sweat, and tears into my business while my family thought I was just a glorified property manager. I never corrected them because I knew they would only try to take credit for my hard work or demand money to fund Maya and her endless shopping sprees. Last Tuesday, I drove to my Aunt Valeria's house holding a custom porcelain tea set I had imported from Japan. I spent weeks tracking down the perfect artisan to craft something unique and beautiful. It was my wedding gift for Maya. I wanted to show her that despite our differences, I still loved her and supported her marriage to Connor Sterling. Valerie was my mother's sister, but she was different from the rest of the family. She actually tolerated me, and sometimes even showed me genuine kindness. I walked into her cozy living room filled with the scent of cinnamon and carefully placed the velvet box on her coffee table. I smiled and told her I just booked my first-class flight for Maya's wedding next week. I asked Valerie what color dress she planned to wear so we could match in the family photos. Valerie froze completely solid. The delicate porcelain teacup she was holding slipped from her trembling fingers and shattered against the hardwood floor. Hot tea splashed across my shoes, but neither of us moved a single muscle. Valerie looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. She asked me what I was talking about. She said the wedding already happened. She said it happened yesterday afternoon in a massive cathedral downtown. The air in the room suddenly felt too thick to breathe. My lungs burned as I tried to process her words. I asked her to repeat what she just said. Valerie reached into her pocket with shaking hands and pulled out her phone. She opened a private social media account that Maya had specifically hidden from me. She handed the phone to me and the screen glowed with the undeniable, devastating truth. There was Maya looking like a literal princess in a custom white gown covered in pearls. There was my father Jamal puffing out his chest with immense pride as he walked her down the aisle of a beautiful historic church. There was my mother Brenda, crying tears of absolute joy in the front row, wearing a ridiculous oversized hat. There was Connor Sterling, the wealthy white heir Maya had been dating, looking completely enamored with his beautiful new bride. I stared at the glowing screen as my heart turned to heavy stone inside my chest. Invisible. I was always invisible to them. When I won my first real estate award, my mother conveniently forgot to show up because she had a hair appointment. Invisible. When I bought my first house, my father said he was too busy helping Maya pick out a new luxury car to celebrate my achievement with me. Invisible. I looked at the dozens of family portraits on the screen. Aunts, uncles, cousins. They were all smiling for the camera. Everyone was there except me. I was completely erased from my own family history. Invisible. Valerie touched my arm and apologized profusely. She said she thought I had decided not to attend because of work obligations. She said Brenda told everyone I was too busy closing a real estate deal to make time for my only sister. The lies stacked on top of the betrayal, making me feel physically sick to my stomach. I did not cry. Crying was for people who still had hope that things could change. I simply set the phone down on the table, picked up my purse, and walked out the door without saying another word. The shattered teacup on the floor perfectly matched what was left of my familial loyalty. I got into my car and gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned pale white. My breathing was ragged and shallow as the reality of the situation washed over me. I drove straight toward my parents' house, navigating the familiar streets with a cold, singular focus. My parents lived in a modest suburban neighborhood, but they always acted like they owned a sprawling mansion. I parked my car directly on their pristine, manicured lawn, ignoring the deep, muddy tire tracks I left in the grass. I marched up the concrete steps and kicked the front door open with the heavy heel of my leather boot. The door slammed violently against the wall, echoing loudly through the quiet house. Jamal and Brenda were sitting at the formal dining room table. They were surrounded by torn envelopes and thick stacks of crisp $100 bills. They were laughing and joyfully counting the wedding cash they had received from the wealthy guests. When they saw me standing in the doorway, their laughter died instantly. Jamal stood up, pushing his wooden chair back aggressively. He demanded to know what I thought I was doing, breaking into his house like a common criminal. I walked slowly toward the table, my eyes locked dead on my mother. She did not even have the decency to look ashamed or guilty. Brenda calmly picked up her teacup and took a slow, deliberate sip. I asked them how the wedding was. I asked them if the cake tasted sweet while they lied to their new wealthy in-laws about my very existence. I asked them how they slept at night knowing they had abandoned their oldest daughter. Brenda set her cup down and let out a long, exasperated sigh. She looked at me as if I was a stray dog that had wandered into her clean, immaculate kitchen. She told me to stop being so incredibly dramatic. She said Connor's family belongs to the elite circles of New England old money. She said they are refined conservative people who value quiet tradition and gentle grace. She pointed a manicured finger at my dark jeans and scuffed leather boots. She said my style, my loud voice, and my gritty career in the dirt of real estate would only cause them severe embarrassment. They never cared to ask how I spent my days or nights. If they had bothered to look past their own prejudice, they would have seen a woman who negotiated multi-million-dollar acquisitions before breakfast. They would have seen an executive who commanded boardrooms full of the very same old money elites they were currently bowing down to. But they only saw what they wanted to see. They saw a scapegoat. They saw someone they could comfortably look down upon to make their own mediocre lives feel somewhat significant. Maya was their masterpiece, a carefully constructed doll designed to marry well and lift them out of their working-class insecurities. I was just the rough draft they wanted to sweep under the rug and forget. Brenda continued her cruel monologue, completely oblivious to the silent storm brewing in my eyes. She told me that Connor's parents, William and Beatrice Sterling, were highly observant people. She said they noticed everything and judged everyone. She claimed that my presence at the rehearsal dinner alone would have been enough to make them cancel the wedding entirely. "You take up too much space, Chloe," she sighed, waving her hand dismissively. "You speak your mind when you should stay quiet. You refuse to straighten your hair or dress in a way that puts wealthy white people at ease. Maya knows how to play the game. You only know how to flip the board. We could not risk you ruining the most important day of your sister's life." I listened to her justify her betrayal with a twisted sense of logic that only a true narcissist could invent. She actually believed she was the victim of my personality. She genuinely thought she was protecting her family from me. I looked at Jamal, expecting him to offer at least a fraction of fatherly remorse, but his face was set in stone. He nodded along with every vicious word Brenda spoke, validating her cruelty with his silence. He had always been a weak man, easily swayed by the promise of status and wealth. Seeing him now counting the pitiful stacks of wedding cash, I felt a profound sense of disgust. I asked them if Maya knew they were saying these things. Jamal scoffed and said Maya was the one who suggested it. He said Maya came to them crying, terrified that my rough edges would scare Connor away. The realization that my own sister had orchestrated my exclusion was the final nail in the coffin. The sister I had protected from bullies in middle school, the sister whose college textbooks I had secretly paid for, had deemed me unworthy of attending her wedding. She had thrown me to the wolves to secure her place in a mansion. Unfit. The word echoed in my mind louder than any physical scream. Socially unfit. That is what they thought of the daughter who had bought them their cars and quietly paid off their massive medical debts years ago. Family unfit. I was not a human person to them. I was a dangerous liability. Unfit. They looked at my dark skin, my natural hair, my calloused working hands, and decided I was not worthy of standing beside them in the bright light of their new life. Unfit. I looked at the piles of cash scattered across the table. It was pathetic, really. They were celebrating a few $1,000s in wedding gifts as if they had struck gold in a mine. They were eagerly selling their souls and their firstborn daughter for the cheap illusion of proximity to vast wealth. Jamal crossed his arms over his chest and glared at me with pure contempt. He told me that Maya was finally elevating the family name to a respectable status. He told me to accept my lowly place and stop trying to ruin her happiness out of petty childish jealousy. He pointed a shaking finger toward the front door. He ordered me to get out of his house immediately and stay far away from Maya and her new wealthy husband. He raised his voice, warning me not to ever come crawling back to them when my little property management job inevitably fell apart and I ended up broke. He said they would not spare a single dime to bail me out of whatever financial mess I inevitably created for myself in the future. I did not yell back at him. I did not throw anything across the room. The hot rage inside me had compressed into something sharp and bitterly cold. I looked at the two people who had brought me into this world and realized they were absolute complete strangers. I smiled at them. It was a bitter, terrifying smile that made my father take a cautious step back. I told them I understood the situation perfectly. I told them they would never have to worry about me asking them for money ever again. I told them to enjoy their new wealthy family because they no longer had an oldest daughter to bother them. I turned around and walked out of the house, leaving the front door wide open to the freezing cold wind. As I walked slowly down the driveway, I pulled my encrypted phone from my pocket and securely checked my primary business account. The balance stared back at me in stark, bold numbers. $85 million. That was just my liquid cash on hand. My total net worth, including the luxury estates and resorts I owned across the country, easily dwarfed the entire Sterling family fortune. I took a deep breath of the crisp autumn air, letting the cold fill my lungs and clear my mind. I knew that the road ahead would require patience and absolute precision. I would not simply destroy their lives in a sudden fit of anger. I would dismantle their fake reality brick by brick until they had nothing left but the truth they had tried so hard to bury. I walked to my car, a sleek, unassuming sedan that hid a custom engine, and slipped into the leather driver's seat. I started the ignition and the engine purred to life, matching the low, dangerous hum of adrenaline coursing through my veins. The Sterling family was about to learn a very hard lesson about old money and new power. And Maya was about to learn that you never cross the sister who built the stage you are dancing on. Jamal and Brenda thought they had secured their place in high society by marrying Maya off to a trust fund kid. They thought they had discarded the worthless daughter to protect their shiny new social investment. They had absolutely no idea that I owned the very ground they were so desperate to walk on. The betrayal was complete, but the brutal game of revenge was just beginning. 3 weeks passed since the day I walked out of my parents' house and left the front door wide open to the freezing autumn wind. 3 long weeks of absolute silence from the people who were supposed to be my family. They did not call to apologize, and they did not send a single message to explain why they erased me from my sister's wedding. I spent those 21 days throwing myself entirely into my work at Obsidian Estates. I expanded my portfolio, I negotiated new acquisitions, and I focused on the empire I was building all alone. I channeled every ounce of my anger into my business, making sure my luxury properties were operating at peak perfection. My mind was a fortress of cold calculation. I knew they would eventually reach out because people like my parents and my sister never stay quiet forever. When they want something from you, they view relationships as simple transactions, and I was just waiting for the moment they decided they needed to make a withdrawal. I did not have to wait very long. The phone call finally came on a rainy Tuesday morning while I was drinking my hot coffee. I was sitting in my spacious corner office looking out over the city skyline when my private cell phone began to vibrate on the glass desk. The caller identification displayed, "My sister is name Maya Sterling." She had already changed her last name to match her wealthy new husband. I stared at the glowing screen for a moment, watching it vibrate against the glass. I felt a brief flicker of disgust before I calmly picked up the device. I pressed the green button and raised the phone to my ear without saying a single word of greeting to her today. Chloe, my sister, chirped through the receiver. Her voice was dripping with a sickeningly sweet, fake enthusiasm that made my skin crawl. She sounded exactly like someone who had not just committed the ultimate betrayal. "Oh my goodness, it has been so long," she continued, acting as if we were just two close sisters catching up on a casual weekday morning. "How have you been doing lately? I heard you have been super busy with your little property management jobs." I let her speak, allowing the silence on my end to stretch out uncomfortably long and freezing cold for her. She did not seem to care that I was not speaking. She just kept talking, filling the void with her endless self-absorbed chatter. She told me all about her fabulous honeymoon in Europe. She bragged about the expensive hotels they stayed in and the designer clothes her new husband bought for her. She painted a perfect picture of her new elite lifestyle, carefully making sure I knew just how much money the Sterling family had today. She was rubbing her perceived superiority in my face while completely ignoring the fact that she had banned me from her own wedding. I continued to listen to her grating voice while I scrolled through the financial reports on my computer's screen. She finally took a breath and shifted her tone from bragging to demanding. She told me that Connor's parents wanted to host a post-wedding family integration getaway. She explained that the Sterlings loved spending time in nature, but only if it involved absolute five-star luxury. She said they wanted to gather both families together for a full week of bonding in the mountains to celebrate the union of the Davis and the wealthy Sterling family bloodlines right now. She told me she had been searching for the perfect location to impress her new wealthy in-laws. She said she remembered that I was currently working as a hired property manager for a massive estate near Lake Tahoe. She was talking about the crown jewel of the Obsidian Estates portfolio, a sprawling multi-million-dollar property that sat right on the edge of the crystal-clear water. She told me she needed me to pull some strings with my boss and secure the entire estate for her and the Sterling family for a full 7-day-long trip soon. She did not ask me if it was possible. She simply demanded it as if I was her personal assistant waiting to fulfill her every whim. She said I needed to hand over the keys by the end of the week so she could impress Connor and his parents. She added that I should probably stay out of sight while they were there because she did not want my gritty working-class vibe to ruin the elegant atmosphere she was trying to create. She actually told me to hide in the background while she played the rich, graceful hostess instead. Take. The word began to pulse in my mind like a warning siren. They take and take. My entire life had been a series of them taking whatever they wanted from me without ever saying thank you. They took my peace of mind. They took my financial savings when they needed to pay off their debts. They took my dignity when they hid me from the world because they were ashamed of my dark skin and my loud voice. They always take. And now my sister wanted to take the most beautiful property I owned to impress absolute strangers today. They take and take. She wanted me to risk my supposed job so she could play pretend in a mansion she could never afford on her own. They always take. She wanted to use the fruits of my labor to elevate her own status while simultaneously pushing me into the shadows. Take. The sheer audacity of her request was almost physically repulsive. She had excluded me from her wedding just 3 weeks ago, and now she expected me to hand over a luxury estate so she could continue to build her fake narrative for the powerful Sterling family members entirely. I slowly leaned back in my leather office chair and let out a soft, chilling laugh. The sound echoed in the quiet room, taking Maya completely by surprise. "Excuse me?" she asked, her voice losing its fake sweetness and taking on a sharp edge of irritation. What is so funny about me asking for a simple favor from my older sister? I stopped laughing and brought the phone closer to my mouth. I told her she was absolutely out of her mind if she thought I would ever do a single favor for her ever again in this life truly. I told her that my answer was no. I said it firmly and clearly without any room for negotiation or compromise. I told her I would not lift a single finger to help her impress the family she had sold her soul to join. I reminded her that she had made her choice when she lied to Connor about my existence and banned me from her wedding. I told her she could go find a cheap motel for her wealthy in-laws because she was not getting anywhere near the Lake Tahoe estate. The answer is absolutely undeniably forever no. Maya gasped in outrage. She immediately started yelling into the receiver, demanding that I stop being so selfish. She accused me of trying to sabotage her marriage because I was jealous of her happiness. She said I owed it to the family to help them maintain their new social status. She told me I was just a bitter, lonely woman who wanted to see her own sister fail. I let her scream until her voice grew hoarse. I did not raise my voice. I simply told her to lose my number, and I ended the phone call right then there. I placed the phone face down on my desk and let out a long, slow breath. The confrontation had been brief, but it confirmed everything I already knew about my sister. She was a parasite who only viewed people as tools to be used and discarded at her convenience. She had no remorse for her actions. She only cared about what she could extract from me. I turned my attention back to my work, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. I knew Maya would not accept my refusal gracefully. She would definitely complain to our parents about my behavior today. I fully expected them to try and pressure me, but I was no longer the obedient daughter. They could manipulate with guilt and insults. I was the chief executive officer of my own life, and I held all the power. They just did not know it yet. The rest of my Tuesday passed quietly. I finalized a merger and reviewed the architectural plans for a new resort development in Colorado. I went home to my penthouse apartment and slept more peacefully than I had in weeks, knowing I had successfully defended my boundaries against my toxic sister and family members. The peaceful silence did not last very long. The very next morning, I arrived at the Obsidian Estates corporate headquarters, ready to begin my day. I was wearing a sharp charcoal-tailored suit and carrying a fresh cup of dark roast coffee. The lobby of my building was a grand, expansive space with soaring glass windows and sleek marble floors. It was a monument to the success I had built with my own two hands. I greeted my security team and walked toward the private elevators, feeling completely in control of my environment and my destiny at that exact moment. Suddenly, the heavy glass doors of the lobby burst open. Jamal and Brenda marched into the building looking like a thunderstorm ready to unleash chaos. They were both dressed in their Sunday best, clearly trying to look intimidating and important. My mother was clutching her designer handbag like a weapon, and my father had a furious scowl etched deeply into his face. They marched straight past the reception desk, completely ignoring the security guards who tried to ask for their identification. They were on a mission to put their disobedient daughter back in her proper lowly place right away today. I stopped walking and turned to face them, a cold smile playing on my lips. They stomped across the marble floor, their shoes echoing loudly in the cavernous space. Brenda pointed her finger at me from 20 feet away, her voice carrying across the lobby for all my employees to hear. She demanded to know what was wrong with me. She yelled that Maya had been crying all night because I had cruelly refused to help her secure the Lake Tahoe property for the Sterling family vacation. She called me a spiteful and jealous older sister to my face publicly. Jamal stepped up beside her, his face red with unchecked anger. He told me I was going to march right up to my boss and demand the keys to that estate. He said if I did not comply immediately, he would personally find the manager of this building and tell them what a difficult and insubordinate employee I was. He threatened to make such a massive scene that I would be fired on the spot. He said I was going to hand over that property, or he would completely ruin my pathetic little career in real estate for good now. I stood perfectly still, holding my coffee cup, while my parents threatened to destroy my life in the middle of my own corporate lobby. They looked so small and foolish, making their aggressive demands while standing in a building that I legally owned. They thought they could intimidate me by threatening to call my boss. They had no idea that they were currently screaming at the sole owner and chief executive officer of Obsidian Estates. The hook was set, and they had just willingly walked right into the jaws of the perfect trap I was building for their downfall today. My father, Jamal, stepped closer to me until he was practically invading my personal space right there in the center of the grand marble lobby. His face was twisted into an ugly mask of entitlement and rage. He pointed a thick finger at my chest and told me that I was going to march up to my supervisor this exact second and demand the keys to the Lake Tahoe property. He said if I refused to obey him, he would personally find the highest-ranking manager in the building and tell them what a useless and disrespectful employee I was today. Brenda nodded along with his threats, crossing her arms over her expensive designer coat that I had secretly paid for 2 years ago. She added that they would make sure I lost my pathetic little property management job and ended up sleeping on the streets if I ruined the chance for Maya to impress her wealthy new white-in-laws. They stood there shouting at me, completely oblivious to the fact that the security guards watching us were on my personal payroll. They were threatening to get me fired from a company where I owned every single share entirely today. I looked at their angry, greedy faces and realized how incredibly easy it would be to destroy them right then and there. I could have snapped my fingers and had my security team drag them out onto the pavement. I could have pulled out my corporate credentials and watched their smug expressions crumble into absolute horror and humiliation. But crushing them in a lobby was too small of a punishment for the betrayal they had committed. They had erased me from their family history so they could pretend to be high society royalty. They needed grander stages to fall absolutely. Smile and nod. The thought entered my mind like a quiet, rhythmic chant. Smile and nod. Let them dig the hole. Smile and nod. I needed them to feel powerful. I needed them to think they had successfully intimidated the stubborn older daughter into submission. So I let my shoulders slump forward slightly. I lowered my eyes toward the polished floor and let my voice tremble just a fraction of an inch when I spoke to them. I told them to please lower their voices because I did not want to get fired by upper management today right now completely. Brenda smirked, a terrible, triumphant expression spreading across her face. She thought she had won. She stepped closer and told me that I finally understood my proper place in the family hierarchy. She said all I had to do was secure the Lake Tahoe estate for 1 week, and they would forget my previous rudeness on the phone. She patted my cheek with cold hands and told me that Maya was counting on this vacation to secure her position in the Sterling family empire. She said I owed it to them to make myself useful for once in life today. Smile and nod. Smile and nod. Let them dig the hole. Smile and nod. I looked up at my parents and played the role of the desperate, terrified employee flawlessly. I told them that the Lake Tahoe property was the most exclusive and expensive estate in our corporate portfolio. I told them that my boss was extremely strict and would never just hand over the keys to a random family for a vacation without massive security deposits and intense supervision. I stammered slightly, pretending to be nervous about losing my job if anything went wrong during their luxurious getaway completely. Jamal rolled his eyes and scoffed at my hesitation. He told me to stop making pathetic excuses and just do what I was told. He said I needed to figure out a way to get those keys today, or he would start screaming for the building manager right now, immediately. I raised my hands in a placating gesture, acting like I was surrendering to his aggressive demands. I told him I could pull some strings and get the keys, but there was one absolute non-negotiable condition. I said my corporate boss would only approve the request if I went. Brenda immediately frowned and shook her head in sheer disgust. She said absolutely not. She told me my loud presence and gritty working-class aesthetic would completely ruin the elegant, aristocratic atmosphere they were trying to curate for the Sterling family. She said Connor and his wealthy parents would ask uncomfortable questions if they saw her sister working there as a lowly property manager. She flatly refused to let me stay at the estate. I simply shrugged my shoulders and told her that without my direct physical supervision on the property, the company would never release the keys ever today. I watched the greedy panic flash across their faces. They needed that luxury mansion desperately. They had already promised the Sterling family a breathtaking post-wedding mountain retreat, and they had absolutely no money to rent a place like that on their own. They were backed into a corner of their own making entirely. Jamal pulled Brenda aside, and they began to whisper frantically to each other in the middle of the lobby. I stood there sipping my dark roast coffee, enjoying the sweet taste of victory, as they unknowingly negotiated the terms of their own impending spectacular downfall right now. Smile and nod. Smile and nod. Let them dig the hole. Smile and nod. After a few minutes of intense whispering, my parents turned back to face me. Brenda looked like she had swallowed a bitter lemon. She told me they would agree to let me come to the Lake Tahoe estate, but only under their strict, explicit rules. She said I would not be allowed to act like a member of the family. She commanded me to pack a plain, crisp black uniform and play the role of a hired servant for the entire duration of the Sterling vacation. Jamal pointed his finger at my face again and listed the rest of his cruel demands. He told me I was strictly forbidden from speaking to Connor or his wealthy white parents unless I was spoken to first. He said I was to serve their food, clean their messes, and stay completely out of sight whenever possible. He told me that if I dared to tell the Sterling family that I was related to Maya in any way, shape, or form, he would make sure my life was a living nightmare. He demanded that I act like an invisible servant. It was breathtaking, really. My own parents were ordering me to become a silent servant in my own multi-million-dollar luxury estate, just so my sister could pretend to be a wealthy heiress. They wanted me to scrub floors and serve drinks to the very people she had lied to. They thought this arrangement was a punishment for me. They thought they were putting me in my place. They had no idea that they were simply giving me the perfect front row seat to orchestrate the most devastating and absolute destruction of their pathetic fake lives. I looked submissive. Smile and nod. Smile and nod. Let them dig the hole. Smile and nod. I swallowed my pride and nodded my head gently. I told them I understood the rules perfectly. I promised I would wear a plain black uniform and stay completely hidden in the background like a proper servant. I promised I would not breathe a single word about my true identity to the Sterling family. I said I would go upstairs to my office, grab the keys to the lake house, and make sure everything was flawlessly prepared for their grand arrival at the property this weekend. Brenda let out a haughty sniff of approval. She adjusted the strap of her expensive handbag and told me it was about time I did something useful for the family instead of being a constant source of embarrassment. Jamal warned me one last time not to mess this up before he turned on his heel and marched toward the exit. Brenda followed closely behind him, her head held high in fake aristocratic grace. I watched them walk out through the heavy glass doors of my building, utterly convinced that they had just dominated and defeated their troublesome older daughter again. As soon as they were out of sight, the trembling, fearful act melted off my body like snow under a blazing sun. I stood up perfectly straight and threw my empty coffee cup into the nearest trash bin. The security guard standing a few feet away gave me a questioning look, but I just smiled and shook my head entirely. I walked to the private elevator, swiped my platinum keycard, and rode up to the executive floor. My mind was racing with brilliant dark possibilities. The perfect trap had been set, and the mice had just eagerly sprinted inside. I walked into my corner office and immediately picked up my encrypted phone. I dialed the number for my lead property manager at the Lake Tahoe estate. I told him to clear the schedule for the entire upcoming week. I ordered him to give the regular staff a paid vacation and send them all home. I told him I would be taking over the property personally for a private family matter. I then opened my secure desk drawer and pulled out the master keycard for the estate. It was a heavy, sleek piece of black metal representing total ultimate ownership. I spent the rest of the week preparing for the greatest performance of my life. I went to a local supply store and purchased the most basic, humiliating maid uniform I could find. I bought plain black trousers, an uncomfortable white button-down shirt, and a cheap black apron. I folded the garments carefully, knowing that every time I put them on, I would be sealing the miserable fate of my family. They wanted me to be the invisible help. They wanted me to be the servant. I was going to give them exactly what they asked for and more. Smile and nod. Smile and nod. Let them dig the hole. Smile and nod. Along with the cheap uniform, I packed a collection of high-tech micro-recorders and discreet lapel microphones. I packed my encrypted laptop, containing the original property deeds, the banking statements, and the legal documents proving my absolute ownership of the Obsidian Estates empire. I packed my sharpest, most powerful designer business suit in a hidden compartment of my luggage, keeping it perfectly pressed and ready for the exact moment I decided to drop the grand illusion and burn their fake aristocratic world to the ground. On Friday morning, I drove my sleek sedan up the winding mountain roads toward Lake Tahoe. The scenery was breathtaking, with towering pine trees and crystal-clear blue water reflecting the bright sunlight. My estate sat on a private peninsula shielded from the public eye by heavy iron gates and dense forests. It was a sanctuary of wealth and power that I had built through years of relentless grinding work. I parked my car in the staff garage out of sight from the main driveway. I walked into the massive empty mansion and took a deep breath of clean air. The house was dead silent, waiting for the chaos to arrive. I walked into the sprawling gourmet kitchen and laid my cheap black uniform out on the granite counter. I set up the micro recorders in strategic locations around the dining room, the grand living area, and the private study. I made sure every single high-definition security camera on the property was recording with perfect crystal clear audio. I was not just preparing a vacation home, I was preparing a digital graveyard for all their lies. I slipped into the plain black uniform and tied the cheap apron tightly. The stiff fabric scratched against my skin as I smoothed down the dark edges. I stood in the center of the massive gourmet kitchen of my Lake Tahoe estate, looking at my reflection in the dark polished granite countertops. I was the chief executive officer of a multi-million-dollar real estate empire. But today I was playing the role of a lowly servant. I checked the small micro-recorder hidden discreetly beneath my collar, ensuring the green light was blinking steadily. Every single security camera in the mansion was fully operational and recording directly to my encrypted secure server. I walked over to the massive floor-to-ceiling windows in the grand living room and looked down the long, winding driveway. The tall pine trees swayed gently in the cool mountain breeze, waiting for the grand illusion to begin. I did not have to wait much longer. The sound of heavy tires crushing against the gravel echoed through the quiet mountain air. A sleek black luxury sports utility vehicle, followed by a stunning silver convertible, pulled slowly through the massive iron gates of my private peninsula property. They were finally here to claim their fake throne today, right now. I stood perfectly still and stepped back into the shadows of the long hallway, watching the scene unfold quietly through the glass panes of the front entrance. Maya stepped out of the silver convertible wearing a ridiculously expensive white designer coat that my parents had undoubtedly gone into massive debt to purchase for her. Connor Sterling stepped out from the driver's side, looking like the perfect picture of New England, old money wealth. He wore a cashmere sweater and expensive leather loafers, completely unaware that his beautiful new wife was a calculating fraud. The black vehicle parked right behind them, and Connor's parents, William and Beatrice Sterling, emerged slowly. William looked around the sprawling multi-million-dollar estate, with wide eyes clearly impressed by the sheer magnitude of the architecture and the pristine landscaping. Beatrice adjusted her silk scarf and nodded in quiet approval as she took in the panoramic views of the crystal-clear lake. My mother, Brenda, and my father, Jamal, practically leaped out of the back seat of the first vehicle, rushing forward to greet their wealthy new in-laws with sickeningly sweet smiles today. They truly looked absolutely desperate and totally pathetic right here, right now. Maya clapped her hands together and spread her arms wide as she welcomed the Sterling family to her supposed ancestral home. I could hear her high-pitched voice carrying clearly through the cracked front door. She told William and Beatrice that this luxury mountain estate had been in the Davis family for many long years. She boldly claimed that our father Jamal had purchased the entire peninsula as a private sanctuary to celebrate their long history of hard work and generational wealth. The lies flowed from her mouth like poisoned honey, sweet to the ear, but entirely toxic inside. Jamal puffed out his chest and nodded along, proudly accepting the false praise from William Sterling, who clapped him on the back and congratulated him on his magnificent real estate portfolio. Brenda linked her arm through Beatrice's arm and began pointing out the custom stonework and the imported timber beams, acting as if she had personally overseen the construction of the massive house. They were parading around my property, walking on my imported stone driveway, breathing the air of my success, and claiming every single ounce of it as their own. I smiled and pressed the hidden microphone, recording everything perfectly. The grand, heavy front doors swung open, and the two families walked into the sprawling foyer. The ceiling soared 30 feet high with a massive crystal chandelier catching the afternoon sunlight and scattering rainbow prisms across the polished wooden floor. William let out a low whistle of genuine admiration as he took in the modern art pieces and the expensive custom furniture that I had meticulously curated for this specific estate. Maya took Connor's hand and led him into the main living room, pointing toward the massive stone fireplace and spinning a ridiculous fake story about how she used to spend her childhood winters reading books by the fire. She had never stepped foot in this house before today. She had never even seen Lake Tahoe until this morning. But she spoke with such absolute conviction that Connor looked at her with pure, adoring love, completely, entirely blinded by her flawless performance. They were so wrapped up in their fake aristocratic fantasy that they did not even notice me standing quietly near the archway of the formal dining room, with my hands clasped respectfully behind my back, wearing my cheap plain uniform, waiting for their absolute attention right here now. It was Beatrice who finally spotted me standing in the shadows. She paused her admiring gaze of the vaulted ceiling and looked at me with a polite but questioning expression. William turned his head and noticed me as well, raising a curious eyebrow toward my father Jamal. My parents froze in absolute panic. Brenda swallowed hard and her fake smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Jamal looked terrified that I might open my mouth and shatter their entire illusion right then and there. But Maya was a master manipulator, and she did not miss a single beat. She let out a soft, dismissive laugh and waved her manicured hand gracefully in my direction. She told William and Beatrice not to mind the woman standing in the corner. She looked right into my eyes and introduced me to her new wealthy white in-laws. She told them I was just the hired property manager they retained to keep the dust off the furniture and the floors polished while the family was away. She did not say my name. She did not call me her sister. She deliberately stripped away my true humanity in front of these strangers today perfectly. The help. The words echoed in my brain like a hollow drum. Just the help. I looked at my sister wearing her expensive white coat and her diamond rings, standing in the middle of a luxury estate that I owned completely. A stranger in my own home. I was standing in a house built by my own blood and sweat, and my family had reduced me to a nameless servant, the help. I lowered my eyes toward the floor and gave a small, respectful bow, fulfilling the exact role they demanded of me. I did not let the blazing anger show on my face. Just the help. I simply nodded my head silently, absorbing the ultimate humiliation. A stranger in my own home. William and Beatrice gave me a brief dismissive nod, acknowledging my existence exactly as they would acknowledge a piece of furniture before turning their attention back to the spectacular view of the lake. The help. The emotional pain tried to claw its way up my throat, but I swallowed it down deep into my chest. I was not just the help. I was the absolute architect of their impending epic destruction and spectacular total ruin starting today. I turned around quietly and walked back into the massive gourmet kitchen, leaving them to enjoy their grand illusion in the living room. I spent the next few hours preparing the evening dinner service exactly as Brenda had ordered me to do. I arranged the imported caviar, the expensive cuts of prime beef, and the vintage bottles of red wine that I had personally paid for out of my own private business accounts. I moved silently back and forth between the kitchen and the dining room, setting the long mahogany table with crystal glasses and heavy silver cutlery. Every time I entered the room, I listened to the sickening web of lies my parents were spinning. Jamal was actively bragging to William about his fake investments in the stock market. Brenda was telling Beatrice about the fake charity events she supposedly organized back in their hometown. And Maya was feeding Connor fabricated stories about her elite boarding school education that never actually happened. I poured their water, I cleared their empty appetizer plates, and I recorded every single fraudulent word that left their lying mouths. The trap was working perfectly, absolutely flawlessly, and the evidence was piling up by minutes. As the sun began to set over the jagged mountain peaks, the sky turned a brilliant shade of burning orange and deep purple. The two families gathered around the long dining table illuminated by the soft golden glow of the hanging chandelier. I stood quietly in this corner of the dining room, holding a silver tray with a white cloth draped over my arm, acting like the perfect obedient servant they wanted me to be. The dinner conversation flowed easily, fueled by the expensive wine and the intoxicating atmosphere of extreme wealth. William Sterling seemed completely enamored with the property. He kept looking around the room, running his hand over the custom woodwork of the dining table and admiring the seamless integration of modern luxury with rustic mountain charm. He praised Jamal endlessly for having the incredible vision to purchase such a magnificent estate. Jamal soaked up the compliments like a dying plant, absorbing rain, taking full credit for the architectural designs that I had spent months agonizing over with my contractors. It was physically nauseating to watch my father steal my glory while forcing me to stand silently in a cheap black uniform in the corner, right here now. The grand illusion was holding up flawlessly, but the absolute peak of their greedy audacity was yet to come. The plates were cleared, and the families were sipping their final glasses of dark red wine when William Sterling leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished mahogany table. The entire room fell into a respectful silence as the patriarch of the old money family prepared to speak. William looked directly at Jamal with an expression of intense, serious admiration. He told my father that he had been looking for a private luxury mountain retreat for the Sterling family portfolio for the past 3 years. He said he had toured dozens of properties around Lake Tahoe, but none of them possessed the unique, breathtaking beauty and flawless architectural execution of this specific estate. He said the location on the private peninsula was absolutely priceless, and the security of the grounds made it the perfect sanctuary for a family of their high social standing. Maya smiled proudly at Connor, wrapping her hand around his arm and leaning her head against his shoulder, playing the part of the devoted, happy newlywed daughter perfectly. It was a beautiful performance, completely masking her deceitful nature. William cleared his throat and took a sip of his wine before setting the glass down. He told Jamal he was not a man who liked to waste time with long negotiations. He said he preferred to do business directly between families, especially now that their bloodlines were united through Maya and Connor. My father sat up very straight, his eyes widening slightly as he realized where this conversation was heading. Brenda stopped breathing altogether, her hands gripping the edge of the table tightly. William reached into his jacket and pulled out a silver pen, laying it flat on the table. He looked my father dead in the eye and delivered a proposal that made the entire room freeze in shock. William said he loved the property so much that he was willing to bypass all standard procedures today. He offered Jamal $5 million in pure cash to buy the entire estate, right then and there. He said he would have lawyers draft the paperwork tomorrow morning if Jamal agreed to sell immediately. I stood in the shadows gripping my tray as I watched my family stare at the fortune dangling in front of their greedy eyes today completely. The heavy, suffocating silence that fell over the grand dining room felt like an eternity stretching out in the crisp mountain air. My father Jamal stared at William Sterling with his mouth slightly open, unable to fully comprehend the massive fortune being offered to him on a silver platter. $5 million in pure cash to buy a luxury mountain estate he did not even own. I watched from the shadowy corner of the room as the sheer magnitude of the greed slowly overtook his initial shock. Jamal swallowed hard, and his Adam's apple bobbed nervously in his throat. He plastered a fake confident smile across his face and leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished mahogany table. He reached out and shook William's hand firmly, telling him that he would be absolutely honored to sell his beloved ancestral mountain retreat to his wonderful new extended family. Brenda practically vibrated in her seat with suppressed joy, her eyes wide and greedy. Maya looked like she had just won the lottery, biting her lower lip to keep from screaming in delight. The rest of the dinner proceeded with joyful toasts and expensive champagne, celebrating a grand real estate transaction that was built on a foundation of absolute pure fraud. I continued to clear their empty plates and refill their crystal glasses, maintaining my silent, invisible presence while the fire of vengeance burned brightly deep inside my chest. Eventually, the long evening wound down. William and Beatrice announced they were exhausted from the travel and retired to the luxury guest suites on the second floor. Brenda and Jamal quickly excused themselves to their own room, undoubtedly to celebrate their impending imaginary wealth in private. Maya and Connor lingered by the stone fireplace for a while before Connor decided to step outside onto the patio to take a phone call. I gathered the last of the crystal wine glasses onto my heavy silver tray and carried them back into the massive gourmet kitchen to finish my degrading chores. The kitchen was quiet, and filled with the soft humming sound of the industrial refrigerator. I set the heavy tray down on the dark granite counter and began loading the dishwasher with the expensive china plates. The sound of high heels clicking sharply against the imported hardwood floor broke the peaceful silence of the room. I did not have to turn around to know it was my younger sister. Maya strutted into the kitchen, holding a half-empty glass of vintage red wine that I had personally paid for. She leaned against the cool marble island, crossing her ankles and watching me work in my cheap black uniform. She let out a soft, condescending laugh that grated painfully against my ears. She told me I was doing a fantastic job playing the part of a lowly maid today. She said it suited me perfectly to be in the background, scrubbing dirty plates while she secured her future as a wealthy, elite socialite. She took a slow sip of her dark red wine, her eyes dark with malicious joy. She told me she was completely surprised I had actually kept my mouth shut during the long dinner service. She said she thought I would try to ruin her special moment out of pure bitter jealousy because I was a lonely, pathetic woman who had nothing else to live for today completely. I did not look at her right away. I kept my hands submerged in the warm, soapy water, focusing entirely on the porcelain plates. My absolute silence only seemed to fuel her arrogant confidence and her cruel need for dominance. She walked closer, the scent of her expensive perfume mixing with the smell of the rich food and the soapy water. She whispered that today proved once and for all who the real winner in the family was. She said tomorrow Dad would sign the official papers and they would walk away with $5 million, leaving me behind in the dirt where I truly belonged forever. She told me that no matter how hard I worked in my gritty real estate management job, I would never achieve the effortless class and prestige she had secured simply by marrying into the Sterling bloodline. She bragged that her new wealthy in-laws would never even remember my face, because I was just a blurry background detail in her magnificent life story. She said I was nothing more than a stepping stone, an ugly inconvenience that the family had finally learned how to hide away properly. I slowly turned off the running water and grabbed a clean white towel to dry my hands. I turned around and looked at my sister standing there in her designer clothes, utterly intoxicated by her own massive web of lies. I asked her if she honestly believed she could get away with selling a luxury property she did not legally own. Maya smiled a wicked, chilling smile that made her look like a complete stranger. She said reality is only what you can convince other people to believe. She raised her crystal glass of dark red wine, swirling the thick liquid around casually in the air. She looked me dead in the eye, her expression hardening into absolute pure cruelty. She tilted her wrist forward slowly and deliberately. The expensive crystal glass slipped from her manicured fingers and shattered spectacularly against the pristine imported hardwood floor. The thick red wine splashed violently across the polished wood, spreading like a dark pool of blood right at my feet. The sharp pieces of shattered glass scattered everywhere, catching the bright overhead lights. Maya did not even flinch at the loud noise. She stood perfectly still, looking down at the terrible mess she had deliberately created just to exercise her dominance over me right here now. Maya pointed a perfectly manicured finger down at the broken glass and the spreading red stain on the expensive wood. She ordered me to get down on my hands and knees and clean it up immediately. She told me I needed to learn exactly what my proper place was in this world and in this family. She said I was nothing but a pathetic loser and invisible nobody, and it was time for me to scrub the floor like the obedient, quiet servant I was meant to be today completely. She demanded that I beg for her forgiveness for ever thinking I could question her brilliant plans. She stood over me like a tyrannical queen, expecting her loyal peasant to bow down and kiss the dirt at her feet. The sheer audacity of her behavior was absolutely staggering. She had just committed severe fraud at the dinner table, and now she was demanding that I humiliate myself in my own house, simply to feed her massive, fragile ego. Before I could respond to her outrageous demand, the heavy wooden kitchen doors swung wide open. Connor walked into the room still holding his cell phone in his right hand. He stopped dead in his tracks when he saw the shattered glass and the dark red wine pooling on the beautiful hardwood floor. His handsome face immediately fell into an expression of genuine deep concern. He rushed forward and asked Maya what had happened and if she was hurt. Maya instantly completely changed her entire demeanor in the blink of an eye. Her wicked, cruel smile vanished and was seamlessly replaced by a sweet, innocent look of mild distress. She placed her hand softly on Connor's chest and told him it was just a silly, clumsy accident on her part. She said she had slipped and dropped the glass by mistake. Connor, being the decent, well-raised man, he was immediately reached for a roll of paper towels resting on the counter. He said he would help clean up the dangerous mess so nobody would step on the broken glass and cut their feet. Maya grabbed his wrist tightly and physically stopped him from helping. She let out a soft, musical laugh and told him not to be ridiculous. She looked over at me with cold, dead eyes and told her new husband that they had hired help specifically for this exact reason. She said it was my job to clean up after them, and he should absolutely not dirty his expensive clean clothes doing servant work. She treated me like actual dirt in front of him, stripping away my basic human dignity without a second thought. Connor looked at me apologetically, clearly uncomfortable with the way his new wife was speaking to a working person, but he ultimately yielded to her sweet, aggressive manipulation. He told Maya they should head upstairs to their master suite and let me do my job in peace. Maya agreed, leaning into his embrace affectionately, but she threw one last triumphant, glaring look at me over his shoulder as they turned to leave. She was showing me that she owned him, and she owned me in this moment. She commanded me to make sure the floor was absolutely spotless before I went to sleep in the tiny staff quarters. Scrub. The word hit my mind like a physical, heavy blow as they walked out of the kitchen together, leaving me alone with the mess. I slowly lowered myself down onto my hands and knees on the cold, hard floor. I picked up the wet paper towels and began to wipe away the spilled red wine. Scrub. Scrub away the dignity. The rough paper dragged across the imported wood, soaking up the dark liquid that looked so much like spilled blood. Scrub away the family. I picked up the sharp pieces of shattered crystal, feeling the dangerous edges against my calloused, working skin. I realized in that exact moment that they had permanently broken something inside me that could never be repaired again, ever. Scrub. I wiped the floor until it was perfectly clean, erasing the stain of my sister's deliberate cruelty. Scrub. I stayed on my knees long after the floor was dry, letting the cold, dark realization wash over my entire soul. Scrub away the family. Scrub. They were no longer my parents, and she was no longer my sister. They were parasites trying to drain the life and wealth out of me. Scrub. Scrub away the family. Scrub. I finally stood up, throwing the ruined wine-soaked towels directly into the stainless steel trash bin. I brushed the invisible dust off my plain black trousers and untied the cheap scratching apron from my waist. The subservient, terrified act melted away from my body, instantly leaving only the cold, calculating chief executive officer behind. I walked out of the quiet kitchen and slipped silently down the dark hallway toward the hidden utility corridors of the massive estate. I bypassed the luxurious guest rooms and entered the secure, reinforced control room that served as the digital nervous system for the entire peninsula property. The room was completely dark, except for the pale blue light radiating from dozens of high-definition security monitors lining the walls. I sat down in the heavy leather chair and typed my complex encrypted password into the main master console. The digital screens flickered to life, showing every single angle of the sprawling mansion in perfect razor-sharp clarity. I watched the dark, empty hallways and the quiet living spaces, waiting patiently to see what my greedy family would do next in the dead of the night. I knew their uncontrollable greed would not allow them to simply go to sleep after being offered $5 million. My eyes darted to camera number 4, which was positioned right outside the grand formal study on the main floor. The heavy oak doors of the study slowly creaked open, casting a long shadow into the hallway. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the console as the high-definition camera captured the scene perfectly. My father Jamal and my sister Maya were sneaking quietly into the dark room, looking frantically over their shoulders to make sure no one was watching them right now. Jamal's face was pale and slick with nervous sweat, reflecting the dim moonlight coming through the windows, while Maya's eyes burned with a frantic, desperate kind of greed that was terrifying to witness. They locked the heavy wooden doors behind them, completely unaware that I was watching and recording their every single move from the walls of the very house they were trying to steal. They were stepping right into the absolute center of my digital web. They had $5 million dancing in their heads, and they were sneaking into the private study to hatch a devastating fraudulent scheme that would ultimately seal their spectacular permanent doom today. I reached out and pressed the red recording button on the master console, making sure the audio feed was turned up to maximum volume. The trap was set, the bait was taken, and I was about to watch them commit a massive felony on crystal clear high-definition video right here, right now. I watched the screen intently as Jamal paced back and forth across the expensive Persian rug in the study. He was rubbing his hands together rapidly, clearly terrified of the massive lie they were about to execute, but entirely blinded by the prospect of instant wealth. Maya was sitting behind the large mahogany desk, pulling out reams of blank paper and booting up the computer terminal that I had intentionally left unlocked for them. She was whispering aggressively to our father, telling him that this was their only chance to secure their future, and that he needed to stop acting like a coward. The audio feed picked up every single vicious, greedy word they spoke to each other in the quiet room. Maya told him that William Sterling was a man of his word, and if they could just produce a convincing legal document transferring the ownership of the estate, they would be completely set for life. Jamal stopped pacing and leaned over the desk, asking her how they could possibly forge a deed for a house they knew nothing about. Maya laughed that same cruel, condescending laugh she had used on me in the kitchen. She told him it did not matter if the document was perfectly legitimate, because old money rich people like the Sterlings rarely checked the fine print when they were making casual personal family deals. She said they just needed something that looked official enough to get the $5 million wire transfer started by tomorrow morning. I sat back in my leather chair in the security room, sipping a fresh bottle of cold water as I watched them plot their own criminal destruction. They were conspiring to commit grand larceny, wire fraud, and forgery, all while sipping the wine I bought and sitting in the house I built. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of my family was almost impressive in a deeply sickening way. They were so focused on the money that they did not even consider the consequences of their actions. They did not wonder why the study was left open. They did not wonder why the computer had no password protection. They were entirely consumed by the blinding light of their own greed. I zoomed the camera in closer, capturing the exact moment Maya found a generic property transfer template on the internet and began filling in Jamal's name as the sole legal owner of the Obsidian Estates crown jewel property. My finger hovered over the keyboard, ready to unleash the next phase of my retaliation, but I held back. I needed them to finish the forgery. I needed them to fully commit to the crime before I brought the heavy hammer of justice down upon their heads. The long night was far from over, and the perfect trap was closing tighter around them with every single keystroke Maya made on that computer. I sat perfectly still in the dim blue light of the security control room, watching the two people who raised me orchestrate their own spectacular downfall. The monitor illuminated every bead of sweat on my father's forehead as he paced across the Persian rug in the formal study. The clicking of the keyboard echoed through the audio feed as Maya typed furiously, filling out the fraudulent transfer template she downloaded from a website. Jamal stopped pacing and wiped his hands on his pants. He looked at the bright computer screen with a mixture of absolute terror and overwhelming desire. He asked Maya if she was certain William Sterling would not demand the original title deeds before wiring the $5 million tomorrow. Maya let out a sharp sigh and rolled her eyes. She told him to stop acting like a nervous child and start acting like the wealthy patriarch he was pretending to be today. She said billionaires like William operate entirely on trust and handshakes when dealing with equals in high society. Greed. The word tasted like ash as I listened to them rationalize a felony. Blind, stupid greed. They were so blinded by $5 million that they could not see the trap closing around their ankles. Greed destroys. It destroys logic, familial loyalty, and any remaining shred of human decency. I zoomed the hidden camera in closer on Maya's face. She did not look nervous or scared at all. Her eyes were wide with a feverish intensity, making her look like a different person. She was intoxicated by the thought of securing her place in the Sterling Empire and willing to drag our father into a federal crime. Jamal leaned over the desk and pointed at the screen. He asked her what they were going to do about me. He reminded her I was sleeping in the staff quarters and technically worked for the company managing the estate. He said if I found out I could call my superiors and ruin the transaction before the wire cleared. Maya let out another one of her sickeningly sweet, condescending laughs. She waved her hand dismissively in the air, as if I was nothing more than an annoying insect buzzing around her perfect life. She told Jamal not to worry about her loud, pathetic older sister. She said she had a flawless plan to keep me completely quiet. Once the $5 million hit his account tomorrow, they would throw a few $1,000s in my direction. She said I was just a desperate, gritty real estate worker who had probably never seen more than $2,000 at one time in my entire miserable life. She claimed that handing me a small stack of cash would be more than enough to buy my absolute silence and send me running back to my cheap apartment in the city. She actually believed that tossing me a few crumpled bills would make me bow my head and thank them for their incredible generosity. Greed. The word pounded against my skull as I listened to her outline my worth. Blind, stupid greed. She sat in a mansion I built, calculating how to buy my silence with pocket change. Greed destroys. It was destroying the very foundation of her soul, right there on the high-definition video feed. I watched as Jamal slowly nodded his head in agreement. The fear left his body, and sudden wealth took complete control of his mind. He told Maya that she was an absolute genius. He said, giving me a tiny fraction of the money was a brilliant strategy because it would make me complicit in their secret and guarantee that I would never open my mouth to ruin their perfect facade. They actually smiled at each other in the quiet study, bonding over their shared delusion and their mutual willingness to commit grand larceny. I leaned closer to my master console and increased the audio volume so I could hear every single keystroke. Maya opened a new tab on the web browser and searched for a standard power of attorney document. She told Jamal that they needed to forge a paper trail just in case the Sterling family lawyers asked for secondary documentation down the road. She said they needed to create a fake chain of custody, proving that Jamal had the sole legal authority to sell the Obsidian Estates property without anyone else interfering. She rapidly filled in his name and a fake corporate registry number she completely invented. The sheer audacity of her actions was almost mesmerizing to watch. She committed wire fraud, identity theft, and forgery, all while wearing designer clothes bought with money she took from me years ago. Jamal walked around the heavy desk and stood directly behind her, looking over her shoulder at the fraudulent documents. He asked her how they would bypass the official notary requirements. Maya smirked and opened her designer handbag, pulling out a heavy metallic stamp. She proudly showed our father, explaining she secretly stole a legitimate notary stamp from a paralegal working at Connor's law firm. She had brought the stolen notary stamp with her on her honeymoon vacation, just waiting for the perfect opportunity to use it to secure her ultimate financial dominance. Jamal let out a low whistle of impressed admiration and patted her gently on the shoulder. He told her he was incredibly proud of the clever, beautiful woman she had become today. Greed. It was the only driving force left in their hollow, empty bodies. Blind, stupid greed. A father congratulating his daughter for stealing legal equipment and orchestrating a massive real estate scam against her sister. Greed destroys. It was destroying every single memory of a happy childhood I might have ever tried to hold on to. I watched as Maya finished typing the final fraudulent clauses into the digital transfer deed. She typed my father's name as the primary seller and William Sterling as the primary buyer. She typed the purchase price as exactly $5 million paid in full via immediate wire transfer. She reviewed the document carefully, making sure there were no errors that might tip off the patriarch tomorrow morning. She told Jamal that the documents were absolutely flawless and ready to be printed, signed, and stamped right now. My heart rate slowed to a calm, steady rhythm as the defining moment of their criminal conspiracy finally arrived. This was the exact point of no return. Once those fraudulent documents received their fake signatures, the federal crime would be fully executed. Maya reached forward and clicked the print icon on the computer screen. She selected the default wireless printer located on a small table in the corner of the formal study. The loading icon spun on the monitor as the digital file was transmitted. I did not hesitate for a single microsecond. My fingers flew across my encrypted master keyboard, accessing the administrative override controls for the entire local area network of the mansion. I swiftly intercepted the print job before it could reach the physical machine in the study. I paused their fraudulent document in the digital queue, suspending it harmlessly in the network void. Maya frowned as the printer in the corner remained completely silent and dark. She clicked the print icon a second time, muttering under her breath about cheap electronics ruining her perfect momentum. Jamal asked what was wrong, and she told him to hold on while she figured out the connection. She had no idea I was sitting in the hidden security room, controlling the flow of their digital crimes. I opened a secure folder and retrieved a highly specific dummy contract that my corporate lawyer Bradley had drafted for training purposes. The dummy contract looked exactly like a legitimate real estate transfer deed. The formatting was identical, the legal jargon was perfect, and the signature lines were placed exactly where Maya would expect them to be. However, the fine print buried deep within the dense paragraphs of the dummy document contained a very specific legally binding confession. The tiny text explicitly stated that the person signing openly admitted to committing premeditated real estate fraud, forgery, and attempted grand larceny. It contained a clause stating the signer surrendered all rights to any future legal defense and fully confessed to attempting to steal property from Obsidian Estates. It was a brilliant, beautiful piece of corporate sabotage, and I was about to hand-deliver it straight into their greedy, waiting hands today. I silently replaced Maya's fraudulent file with my custom dummy contract in the print queue. I released the hold, allowing the network to push the new file directly to the machine in the study. The printer in the corner suddenly whirred to life, its internal gears grinding softly in the quiet room. Maya let out a loud sigh of relief and smiled at our father. She told him the machine was finally working, and their $5 million ticket to absolute freedom was currently printing out right now. Jamal walked over to the printer and watched eagerly as the crisp white pages slid out into the plastic tray. He picked up the warm papers and held them like they were made of solid gold. He had no idea he was holding a comprehensive legal confession to a massive federal crime. Jamal carried the documents back to the heavy mahogany desk and laid them out flat next to the stolen notary stamp. Maya handed him a sleek black fountain pen and pointed to the dotted line at the bottom of the final page. She told him to practice his signature on scrap paper so his hand would not shake when he signed the document tomorrow in front of William. Jamal nodded seriously, taking the pen and carefully scripting his name over and over again until he felt perfectly confident in his fraudulent performance. He was entirely focused on his signature and did not bother to read a single word of the tiny print resting just inches above his moving hand. Greed. It completely blinds you to obvious dangers right in front of your face. Blind, stupid greed. They were willingly signing their own arrest warrants, and they were smiling while they did it. Greed destroys. It was about to destroy their entire fake reality and send them straight into the cold, harsh reality of the criminal justice system. I watched through the security monitors as Maya took the stolen stamp and pressed it firmly down next to the blank signature line, leaving a dark blue official-looking seal on the dummy contract. She held the paper up to the moonlight, inspecting their criminal handiwork with pure, greedy satisfaction. She told Jamal they would be filthy rich by tomorrow evening and promised she would never let anyone look down on the family ever again. I leaned back in my heavy leather chair and let out a long breath. The trap was flawlessly set, and the physical evidence of their premeditated felony was now resting safely on the desk, waiting for the morning light. They thought they had outsmarted everyone. They thought they had manipulated the wealthy Sterlings and outmaneuvered their gritty, invisible sister. They believed they were the brilliant masterminds of a victimless crime that would elevate them to the highest peaks of elite society. They had absolutely no idea that the silent servant they forced to scrub the floor was the actual architect of their impending permanent destruction. I watched them place the dummy contract into a leather folder, completely unaware of the massive storm gathering just over the horizon. I reached for my phone and typed a quick message to Bradley, confirming that Phase 1 was complete. He replied instantly, letting me know that he was fully prepared for tomorrow. I set the phone down and kept my eyes glued to the monitors. They whispered final words of celebration before turning off the lights and sneaking back down the hallway toward their bedrooms. The fake real estate transfer deed rested innocently on the heavy mahogany desk in the formal study, while my father Jamal and my sister Maya tiptoed back to their luxurious bedrooms in the dark. They had no idea the document they just signed was a legally binding confession to grand larceny, wire fraud, and attempted forgery. I remained in the security control room for another hour, monitoring the quiet hallways to ensure the entire estate was completely asleep. Once I was absolutely certain they were down for the night, I slipped out of the room and made my way silently through the dark mansion. I entered the study and picked up the leather folder containing their criminal handiwork. I took a high-resolution photograph of the signed document with my encrypted phone and sent it directly to Bradley, my corporate attorney. He responded within 2 minutes, confirming that the confession was airtight and that he was finalizing the strategy for tomorrow evening. I left the folder exactly where they had placed it and retreated to my temporary staff quarters to get a few hours of sleep before the final act of their destruction commenced. The next morning, the crisp mountain air was buzzing with an electric, nervous energy. I woke up early and put on the cheap plain black uniform and the scratching white button-down shirt. I tied the apron tightly around my waist and began preparing a massive, lavish breakfast spread for the two families. The Sterlings and my parents drifted into the formal dining room around 9 o'clock, looking incredibly pleased with themselves. William Sterling was in excellent spirits, talking loudly about his plans to renovate the boathouse once the transaction was finalized. Jamal nodded enthusiastically, his eyes darting occasionally toward the hallway that led to the study, where his $5 million ticket to freedom was waiting. Maya was practically glowing, holding Connor's hand across the table and playing the role of the humble, gracious hostess. Brenda completely ignored my presence as I poured her fresh coffee, treating me like an invisible piece of the background scenery, while she bragged about her non-existent philanthropic endeavors back home. They were entirely consumed by their own greed and their fabricated reality. The entire day was a masterclass in psychological torture. My family continued to order me around the estate, treating me with open disdain whenever the Sterlings were out of earshot. Brenda demanded that I iron her expensive silk dress for the evening banquet, snapping her fingers at me and telling me to be careful, not to ruin something I could never afford in 10 lifetimes. Jamal told me to make sure the outdoor patio was completely spotless, because he was about to sign the most important business deal of his life, and he did not want any dirty distractions ruining the atmosphere. Maya was the worst of all. She strutted into the kitchen mid-afternoon while I was chopping vegetables for the grand dinner. She leaned against the marble counter and tossed a crumpled $200 bill directly at my chest. The paper money fluttered down and landed on the floor next to my cheap black shoes. She ordered me to prepare a lavish outdoor banquet for the evening because Jamal and William would be signing a massive business deal. $200. The phrase echoed in my mind like a cruel, heavy joke. The price of my silence. She was attempting to buy my complicity in a $5 million felony with pocket change. $200. She looked down at me with an expression of pure, arrogant superiority, completely convinced that I was desperate enough to accept her pathetic bribe. The price of my silence. She told me to pick up the money and make myself useful by creating a dining experience that would impress her new wealthy family. $200. She said if I did a good job, she might even let me keep the leftovers from the kitchen after they were finished eating. I looked at the crumpled bill on the floor and then looked back at my sister. My face was a mask of absolute calm. I did not show a single ounce of the burning rage that was consuming my chest. I simply nodded my head and bent down to pick up the money. I slipped the $200 into the pocket of my cheap apron and told her the banquet would be absolutely unforgettable today. Maya smiled a wicked, triumphant smile and turned on her heel, walking out of the kitchen with her head held high. She thought she had successfully purchased my loyalty and secured her flawless fake reality. She had absolutely no idea that she had just handed me the final piece of evidence I needed to destroy her completely. I stepped out of the kitchen and walked down the long hallway toward the staff quarters. I pulled my encrypted phone from my pocket and typed a single definitive text message to Bradley. Bring the original deeds and the local sheriff to the estate at 8 p.m. sharp. I hit send and watched the message confirm delivery. The wheels of justice were officially in motion, and there was absolutely nothing my family could do to stop the impending collision. I spent the rest of the afternoon meticulously preparing the outdoor banquet, setting up the grand table under the twinkling fairy lights on the expansive stone patio overlooking the crystal-clear lake. As the sun began to dip behind the jagged mountain peaks, casting long dark shadows across the water, the two families gathered on the patio for the final celebration. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation and the intoxicating smell of expensive champagne. I stood in the shadows near the patio doors, wearing my plain black uniform, holding a silver tray, and watching the scene unfold perfectly. William Sterling stood up from his chair and raised his crystal glass into the air, proposing a grand toast to the joining of their two great families and the fantastic real estate acquisition they were about to finalize. Jamal stood up next, looking nervous, but incredibly greedy. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the leather folder containing the dummy contract they had signed in the dead of night. He placed the folder on the table and pulled out the gold pen, ready to hand over the fraudulent documents and claim his unearned $5 million fortune today right now. I did not wait for another second. I turned around and walked back into the house, heading straight for my private suite on the executive floor. I stripped off the cheap scratching black uniform and the plain white shirt, leaving them discarded on the floor like a shed skin. I pulled out the custom-tailored dark crimson designer suit I had kept hidden in my luggage. The fabric was flawless. The cut was powerful and it radiated absolute authority. I slipped into the suit and fastened the single button, feeling my true identity return to my body instantly. I grabbed the thick manila folder containing the certified original property deeds, the banking statements, and the legal ownership documents for Obsidian Estates. I walked back down the grand staircase, the heavy heels of my designer shoes clicking sharply against the polished wood. I was no longer the silent, invisible servant. I was the chief executive officer, and I was ready to reclaim my throne entirely today. I stepped out onto the patio, just as Jamal was sliding the leather folder across the table toward William Sterling. The fairy lights illuminated my dark crimson suit and the thick folder in my hands. I did not hesitate. I walked directly toward the head of the table, my voice cutting through the crisp mountain air like a sharpened blade. I would strongly advise against signing that. The entire table froze in absolute shock. Jamal dropped his gold pen onto the stone patio, and his face drained of all color. Brenda gasped and covered her mouth with her hand, looking at my designer suit with wide, terrified eyes. Maya jumped up from her chair and screamed at me, demanding to know what I was doing and ordering me to get back to the kitchen immediately. I ignored her entirely and walked straight to William Sterling. I placed the certified original deed of the lake house directly in front of him, on top of the fraudulent dummy contract. I looked him in the eye and introduced myself properly as Chloe, the chief executive officer of Obsidian Estates and the sole legal owner of this entire multi-million-dollar property. The absolute silence that descended upon the outdoor patio was deafening. The cool night breeze rustled the pine trees, but nobody dared to breathe. William Sterling looked down at the certified original deed I had just placed on the table. His eyes scanned the thick embossed paper and the official government seals proving my absolute ownership. He looked up at me, taking in my dark crimson designer suit and the calm authority radiating from my posture. He then turned his gaze toward my father, Jamal, who was currently shaking like a fragile leaf in a violent storm. Jamal could not even look William in the eye. He stared down at the stone patio where his heavy gold pen had fallen. Just moments ago, he had been so eager to put his ink on that fraudulent document. Sign it. The thought had echoed in my mind as I watched him from the shadows. Sign your life away. He had been so blinded by the promise of $5 million that he completely ignored all the warning signs. Sign it. He wanted the wealth so desperately that he was willing to commit a massive federal crime right in front of his new family. Now that gold pen lay on the ground completely useless, while the heavy weight of reality crushed his shoulders. Maya was the first person to break the heavy silence. She slammed her hands onto the table and let out a shrill, desperate laugh. She pointed a shaking finger at me and told William and Connor that I was completely insane. She claimed I was just a disgruntled former employee who had stolen some fake documents from the corporate office to ruin their beautiful family vacation. She begged Connor not to listen to a single word I was saying. She said I was obsessed with their wealth and was trying to extort money from them by creating a massive scene. Her voice cracked as she spoke, the lies tumbling out of her mouth with frantic, terrifying speed. She looked at my parents for support, begging them to back up her ridiculous story. Brenda opened her mouth to speak, but the sheer terror in her eyes prevented any sound from escaping her throat. She knew the game was completely over. She knew that lying to William Sterling now would only make the inevitable criminal charges infinitely worse. Connor Sterling slowly stood up from his chair. He did not look at me. He looked directly at Maya. His handsome face was twisted into a mask of total confusion and growing horror. He asked Maya why a disgruntled property manager would have a certified original deed with government seals. He asked her why her parents were currently shaking in absolute fear instead of kicking an insubordinate employee off the estate. Maya tried to reach out and grab his hand, but Connor took a very deliberate step back away from her. He told her not to touch him until someone explained exactly what was happening right here, right now. Maya began to cry, forcing large, crocodile tears to stream down her perfectly contoured face. She played the victim flawlessly, sobbing about how unfair it was that a crazy servant was ruining her beautiful post-wedding celebration. She told Connor that I was just jealous of their love and wanted to destroy her happiness because my own life was so pathetic and empty. I did not raise my voice. I simply reached forward and picked up the leather folder that Jamal had been holding just a few minutes ago. I opened the folder and pulled out the fraudulent dummy contract they had signed in the dead of the night. I held the document up under the warm glow of the fairy lights, so William and Connor could see it clearly. I told William that the paper he was about to accept in exchange for $5 million was completely, utterly worthless. I explained that my father and my sister had sneaked into the formal study last night to forge a property transfer deed for a luxury estate they did not own. I told the Sterling family that Maya had actively stolen a notary stamp from a paralegal at Connor's law firm to make the fake document look legitimate. Connor's eyes widened in absolute shock as he recognized the distinct blue seal stamped at the bottom of the page. He knew immediately that I was telling the exact undeniable truth. William Sterling snatched the dummy contract from my hand and began reading the fine print. His face turned a dark shade of furious red as he processed the sheer audacity of the scam they had tried to pull on him. He read the specific clause I had hidden deep within the dense legal jargon. He read aloud the paragraph where Jamal explicitly confessed to committing premeditated real estate fraud, forgery, and attempted grand larceny. William looked at Jamal with pure, unadulterated disgust. He asked my father if he was stupid enough to sign a document without reading the fine print. Jamal let out a pathetic whimpering sound. He realized in that exact moment that the piece of paper he thought was his ticket to freedom was actually his signed written confession to a massive federal felony. He had literally signed his own arrest warrant and handed it directly to the man he was trying to steal from today. Sign it. I looked at my father and smiled coldly, remembering how eagerly he had practiced his signature in the study. Sign your life away. He had been so proud of his ability to forge a legal document. Sign it. He had congratulated Maya on her brilliant criminal mind, while they plotted to throw me a few $1,000s to buy my silence. Now he was staring at the undeniable physical proof of his own overwhelming stupidity. The $5 million vanished into thin air, leaving nothing behind but the cold, harsh reality of impending prison time. Brenda finally found her voice. She stood up and walked toward me, her hands raised in a desperate, pleading gesture. She completely dropped the arrogant, wealthy persona she had been maintaining for the Sterling family. She looked like a terrified, broken old woman. She begged me to stop this right now. She used my real name, acknowledging me as her daughter in front of the Sterlings for the very first time. She pleaded with me not to destroy the family over a simple misunderstanding. She claimed they were only trying to secure a better future for everyone and that I was being too harsh on them. She asked me to remember all the sacrifices they made for me when I was growing up. The sheer hypocrisy of her words made my blood boil. I looked at the woman who had forced me to wear a cheap scratching uniform and scrub her floors just 24 hours ago. I asked her how she could possibly stand there and demand loyalty from a daughter she had deliberately erased from her life. I reminded her that she had banned me from the wedding because my dark skin and my gritty real estate career did not fit her fake aristocratic aesthetic. I turned my attention back to William Sterling, who was still gripping the fraudulent contract in his hands. I told him that Maya was not a wealthy heiress from a long line of successful investors. I explained that my parents were heavily in debt and constantly relying on me to bail them out of their terrible financial decisions. I told the Sterlings that Maya had fabricated her entire identity to infiltrate their old money family and secure a comfortable, lazy lifestyle. I revealed that they had orchestrated this entire mountain getaway to scam him out of $5 million because they were absolutely desperate for cash. William listened to every word I said, his jaw clenched tightly with suppressed rage. He was a powerful billionaire who prided himself on his sharp business instincts, and he had almost been swindled by a family of pathetic, desperate con artists today. Maya was completely hysterical now. She fell to her knees on the hard stone patio, sobbing violently and grabbing onto the bottom of Connor's trousers. She begged him to believe that her love for him was completely real, even if the rest of her life was a lie. She said she only lied about her wealth because she was terrified he would reject her if he knew she came from a struggling working-class background. She pleaded for his forgiveness, swearing that she would spend the rest of her life making it up to him. Connor looked down at his new wife with an expression of pure, absolute revulsion. He pulled his leg away from her grasping hands as if her touch was physically burning him. He told her that he did not care about her lack of money, but he cared deeply about the fact that she was a pathological liar and a manipulative criminal. He asked her how she could possibly look him in the eye and vow to love him while secretly plotting to steal $5 million from his father. He asked her how she could force her own flesh and blood sister to wear a maid uniform and scrub the floor just to feed her own sick, twisted ego. Maya could not answer him. She just kept sobbing and repeating that she was sorry over and over again. Connor shook his head and took another step back, distancing himself entirely from the toxic wreckage of her lies. Beatrice Sterling, who had been watching the entire confrontation in stunned silence, finally spoke up. She told her husband William that they needed to leave this dreadful place immediately. She looked at my parents with an expression of such profound aristocratic disgust that Brenda visibly shrank back in shame. William nodded in agreement. He threw the fraudulent dummy contract onto the dining table where the expensive catered food was growing completely cold. He told Jamal that he was the most pathetic excuse for a man he had ever met in his entire life. He promised my father that he would personally ensure the full weight of the legal system came down upon him for this attempted grand larceny. He turned to me and gave a small, respectful nod, acknowledging my authority and my ownership of the estate. He apologized for the intrusion and thanked me for stopping him from making a $5 million mistake today. I nodded back, accepting his apology gracefully. I told him my security team would escort them safely to their vehicles so they could return to the city without any further disturbance from these criminals. As the Sterling family turned to walk back through the grand mansion, Maya let out a blood-curdling scream. She scrambled up from the patio floor and tried to run after Connor, desperately reaching out for his arm. Connor did not even turn around. He told her over his shoulder that his lawyers would be contacting her tomorrow morning to file the paperwork for an immediate absolute annulment based on extreme fraud and deception. He told her to never contact him or his family ever again. The heavy glass doors closed behind the Sterlings, sealing my sister out in the cold mountain air. Her entire fake reality had just evaporated, leaving her with absolutely nothing but the terrible truth. The outdoor patio was eerily quiet now, save for the sound of Maya's pathetic sobbing. Jamal and Brenda stood frozen in place, completely paralyzed by the catastrophic ruin they had brought upon themselves. They looked at me, their oldest daughter, the one they called unfit and invisible. They finally understood the immense devastating power I held in my hands. I had warned them not to cross me. I had told them I would not tolerate their abuse any longer. But their blind, stupid greed had pushed them right off the edge of the cliff, and I simply stood by and let gravity do the rest of the work. I walked over to the dining table and picked up the gold pen that Jamal had dropped. I rolled the expensive metal between my fingers, feeling the smooth, cool surface. Sign it. The repetition anchored itself in my mind, bringing a profound sense of closure. Sign your life away. They had signed away their freedom, their reputation, and their daughter, all for the promise of unearned wealth. Sign it. The contract was just a piece of paper, but it represented every single betrayal, every single lie, and every single moment of cruelty they had inflicted upon me for the past 29 years. I looked at the three broken people standing on my patio. They were no longer a threat. They were just a cautionary tale about the destructive nature of unchecked greed and unearned arrogance. I pulled my encrypted phone from my pocket and checked the time. It was exactly 8 p.m. The distant sound of approaching sirens broke through the quiet mountain night. The flashing red and blue lights began to illuminate the dark pine trees lining the long, winding driveway. My corporate lawyer Bradley had arrived perfectly on schedule, and he brought the local authorities with him to execute the final stage of my revenge. My parents heard the sirens and panic completely consumed their faces. Brenda fell to her knees beside Maya, sobbing uncontrollably and begging me to call off the police. Jamal looked around frantically, as if he could somehow find a place to hide on the open patio. I just smiled my cold, calculating smile and told them that actions have permanent, severe consequences. I told them the days of me quietly paying off their debts and cleaning up their messes were officially over forever. I stood tall in my dark crimson suit, fully embracing my role as the absolute master of my own destiny. The banquet of ruin was complete, and justice was pulling into the driveway today. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers reflected off the dark waters of the lake and illuminated the terrified faces of my family. Jamal was staring at the heavy gold pen he had dropped onto the stone patio just moments before. He looked completely paralyzed by the catastrophic reality of his situation. Maya was still kneeling on the hard stone floor, sobbing hysterically and begging Connor to believe that I was making everything up. She desperately claimed that the certified original deed I had placed on the table was a clever forgery and that I was trying to steal the $5 million from our father out of pure bitter jealousy. She was grasping at straws trying to salvage her shattered aristocratic illusion, but her words were completely empty and devoid of any remaining power. Owner. The word echoed deeply within my mind, anchoring me to the stone patio beneath my feet. I am the owner. I looked down at my sister in her ruined designer dress. Owner of my life. I had built this luxury empire with my own hands, while they tried to erase me from existence. Owner. I pulled my encrypted phone from the inner pocket of my dark crimson designer suit. I looked at William Sterling, who was standing perfectly rigid with his jaw clenched in absolute fury. I told him that before the authorities stepped onto the patio to arrest my family for their premeditated felonies, I had one final piece of undeniable evidence to present to him tonight. I tapped the screen of my device and seamlessly connected it to the high-fidelity outdoor entertainment system that was wired directly into the heavy stone pillars surrounding the grand dining area. The expensive speakers synced with a soft electronic chime that cut through my sister's pathetic sobbing. I opened the digital audio file I had extracted from the hidden security cameras in the formal study last night. I pressed play and pushed the volume slider to its maximum capacity. Maya's recorded voice blasted through the premium surround sound speakers, echoing violently across the quiet, dark mountain lake for everyone to hear perfectly. The crystal-clear audio recording captured the exact moment Maya and Jamal were hatching their devastating scheme. Her voice sounded incredibly arrogant and maliciously cruel as she told our father that William Sterling was a trusting fool who operated purely on handshakes. The recorded audio revealed her explicitly stating that the wealthy patriarch would blindly wire $5 million to their bank account without ever checking the fine print of the fraudulent transfer deed. William Sterling turned a terrifying shade of dark red as he listened to my sister insult his intelligence and plot to steal his fortune on the high-definition recording right in front of his entire family today. Owner. I stood at the head of the banquet table feeling the immense weight of my victory. I am the owner. I watched the fake aristocratic world my family had built burn into a pile of worthless ash. Owner of my life. They had tried to strip me of my dignity, but I had reclaimed every single ounce of my power. Owner. The audio track continued to play, revealing the absolute depth of Maya's massive deception. Her recorded voice laughed, echoing loudly as she admitted that she had completely fabricated her elite boarding school education and her imaginary old money heritage, just to infiltrate the Sterling bloodline and secure a lazy, luxurious lifestyle forever. Connor Sterling stumbled backward as if an invisible force had physically struck him in the chest. His eyes were wide with an unbearable, devastating pain as he listened to the woman he had just married plot to rob his father blind and mock their trusting nature. He looked at Maya kneeling on the stone patio with pure, unadulterated revulsion. Beatrice Sterling covered her mouth with her trembling hands, absolutely sickened by the sheer magnitude of my sister's depravity. Brenda put her hands over her ears, desperately trying to block out the undeniable sound of her daughter's criminal confession. But the outdoor speakers were too loud, and the truth was completely inescapable in the cold mountain air. The audio recording shifted to the part where Maya began talking about me. Her voice dripped with arrogant disdain as she outlined her flawless plan to keep me completely quiet after they stole the $5 million. The speakers blasted her cruel words across the patio as she called me a desperate, gritty real estate worker who had probably never seen more than $2,000 in my entire miserable life. The recorded audio captured her promising to throw a few crumpled bills in my direction because I was an invisible nobody who would eagerly accept pocket change to stay silent and return to my pathetic existence in the city today. Owner. The word pulsed in my veins, giving me absolute strength. I am the owner. I looked at my parents, who were trembling in fear as their darkest secrets were broadcast into the night. Owner of my life. I had survived their emotional abuse and their endless demands for sacrifice. Owner. I paused the audio playback and looked around the destroyed banquet table. I told my family that this is exactly what happens when you build an entire life on a foundation of lies and try to bury the very people who actually support you. I reminded Maya that she actively chose to treat me like dirt and force me into a cheap-made uniform in my own multi-million-dollar house. I told her that her blind, stupid greed was the only thing that brought her to this humiliating, pathetic end today. I said she could have had a comfortable life if she had just been honest, but her obsession with social climbing and tearing me down had led her directly into a federal prison sentence. Jamal was openly weeping, now his shoulders shaking as the reality of his impending arrest finally set in. He tried to take a step toward me to beg for mercy, but the heavy footsteps echoing on the stone pathway leading up to the patio stopped him dead in his tracks. Bradley, my corporate lawyer, stepped into the warm glow of the fairy string lights, followed closely by two uniformed local sheriffs. The officers immediately assessed the scene, resting their hands on their utility belts, as they looked at the terrified faces of my parents and my sister. Bradley walked briskly over to me and handed me a thick manila folder containing the official criminal complaints that had been approved by a federal judge just hours ago. He nodded at me respectfully, acknowledging that the trap had been flawlessly executed and the final stage of my retaliation was ready to commence right now. William Sterling stared at the thick manila folder in Bradley's hands and then looked down at the forged document sitting on the mahogany table. The powerful billionaire did not say a single word at first. He simply reached forward with slow, deliberate movements and picked up the fake transfer deed that my father had been so desperate to sign. William held the fraudulent paper up to the light, examining the stolen notary stamp and the fake signature lines. His face was completely devoid of any warmth or polite high society grace. He looked at Jamal with an expression of such pure, unadulterated disgust that my father physically flinched and took a step backward toward the edge of the stone patio. William Sterling gripped the edges of the thick paper and pulled his hands apart violently, tearing the forged contract straight down the middle. The sharp sound of the heavy paper ripping echoed loudly across the quiet mountain lake. He stacked the torn halves together and ripped them again and again until the $5 million lie was reduced to a handful of worthless shredded confetti. He threw the pieces directly into my father's face. The small white scraps of paper fluttered down like snow, landing on Jamal's expensive suit and scattering across the imported stone floor. William told my father that he was a pathetic, desperate con artist who had severely underestimated the intelligence of the Sterling family. He then pointed a furious finger at Jamal and demanded that the officers arrest him for attempted grand larceny and real estate fraud. The local sheriffs moved forward, pulling heavy metal handcuffs from their belts. Brenda screamed and tried to pull Jamal away, but one of the officers firmly commanded her to step back and place her hands behind her back as well. They informed my mother that she was being arrested as a willing accomplice to a massive criminal conspiracy. The metallic click of the handcuffs snapping shut around my parents' wrists sounded like a beautiful symphony of justice ringing in my ears tonight. Owner. I stood completely still watching them being marched toward the flashing police cruisers. I am the owner. I watched my father lower his head in absolute shame, knowing he had traded his freedom for a fraudulent dream. Owner of my life. I watched my mother cry, real tears of terror, realizing her fake high society persona could not protect her from the harsh reality of the criminal justice system. Owner. They had spent their entire lives pushing me into the shadows so they could shine brightly, but now they were being dragged into the dark back seat of a police car while I remained standing in the light. Maya was completely hysterical, screaming and trashing wildly as the second officer grabbed her arms. She begged Connor to save her, pleading with him to use his family wealth and influence to make the police go away. Connor just stared at her with cold, dead eyes and told her that he would rather die than spend another single second in her presence. He reiterated that his lawyers would be filing for an immediate absolute annulment tomorrow morning, and he promised to cooperate fully with the authorities to ensure she spent decades behind bars for her manipulation and theft today, completely. The officers dragged Maya away from the patio, her designer white coat dragging through the spilled food and dirt on the ground. She looked back at me one last time, her face contorted in a mixture of pure hatred and absolute despair. She finally realized that I had completely orchestrated her destruction from the very beginning. She understood that the invisible, gritty sister she had banned from her wedding was the absolute master of this entire game. I did not say a single word to her. I simply raised my glass of expensive red wine and took a slow, deliberate sip, watching her disappear down the dark, winding driveway forever. The Sterling family gathered their belongings in shocked silence, deeply traumatized by the events of the evening. William Sterling walked over to me and extended his hand, shaking mine with a newfound profound respect. He apologized again forever, doubting my authority, and thanked me for exposing the criminal parasites that had tried to infect his family bloodline. Beatrice Sterling gave me a polite, respectful nod, completely dropping her previous dismissive, aristocratic attitude. Connor looked completely broken, but he managed to thank me for saving him from a lifetime of deception and financial ruin before he followed his parents toward their luxury vehicles. I turned my back on the chaotic, disastrous scene and walked smoothly and confidently through the incredibly heavy glass doors, back into the extremely massive and gorgeously decorated living room of my own breathtaking luxury mountain mansion. The house was completely silent now, empty of the toxic parasites that had tried to drain the life and wealth out of me. I walked over to the custom-built wet bar and poured myself a generous glass of vintage dark red wine from a freshly opened bottle. The rich liquid matched the color of my designer suit perfectly. I took a slow sip, savoring the complex flavors and the sweet taste of absolute victory. I walked up the grand, sweeping staircase toward the second floor. I stepped out onto the expansive master balcony overlooking the front driveway and the heavy iron gates securing my private peninsula. The crisp mountain wind blew gently against my face, but I did not feel cold. I felt incredibly powerful, totally alive, and completely ready to embrace my bright new future. Down below, I watched my private security team forcefully march Maya down the long, dark gravel driveway. Her expensive designer shoes stumbled over the rough stones, and her ruined white coat fluttered pathetically in the breeze. Owner. The repetition settled into my soul, bringing an absolute profound sense of peace. I am the owner. I reached into the pocket of my dark crimson suit and pulled out the crumpled piece of paper Maya had tossed at my chest earlier today. It was the crisp $200 bill she had given me to buy my silence and force me into servitude. I smoothed out the wrinkled edges with my fingers and looked down at my sister as she was shoved outside the iron boundary of my property. Owner of my life. I held the money out over the balcony railing and simply let it go. The $200 bill caught the mountain breeze and fluttered gracefully down through the dark night air, landing directly in the dirt, right at Maya's ruined feet. I leaned over the balcony railing, taking another slow sip of my red wine, and smiled a brilliant, cold smile. "Keep the tip," I whispered into the quiet night, knowing she could not hear me, but feeling the absolute satisfaction of the words anyway. "Now get off my property." The massive, heavy iron gates slowly swung shut with a loud, defining metallic clang, securely locking my completely toxic former family out of my highly beautiful and wildly successful life forever and ever and ever. The greatest lesson I learned from this entire ordeal is that your worth is never defined by the people who refuse to see your true value. Family is not simply a matter of shared bloodlines or historical obligations. True family is built on a solid foundation of mutual respect, honesty, and unconditional support. When toxic people try to dim your light to hide their own massive insecurities, the most powerful response is to simply let them destroy themselves with their own blind greed. You must build your own successful life and protect your peace at all absolute necessary costs today. If you have ever had to completely cut off toxic family members to protect your own personal peace, please share your story in the comments below.